I often talk about how the universe exhibits every indication of having been cosmically designed. For example, I have a series of videos in which I talk about the physical constants of the universe and how they must be set to an incredibly fine degree in order for life to exist. This information, as I stated, comes from secular sources, not from religious thinkers, but from physicists, some of whom are or were hostile to the notion of God's existence. I often get people responding by saying, oh, but if you attribute the universe to God, then you're ascribing it to a cause that is more complex than the universe itself. In other words, the cause is more complex than the effect, and so that is invalid. Now, when I first heard that, I was thinking, where did that come from? That makes no sense. But I kept hearing it over and over again, which made me wonder, where are people getting this line of thinking? As it turns out, it looks like a lot of people get that from Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheistic writers of our time. His writings are interesting insofar as he puts more thought into these issues than your typical person, certainly more so than your typical Christian. But I think his thinking tends to be rather shallow. It'll be convincing to someone who's looking for reasons to reject God, but I don't think they should be convincing to someone who's honestly investigating the facts. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. He rejects God partly based on the notion that God would be more complex than the universe that he supposedly caused. I reject that thinking for three reasons. One is, I don't think God is particularly complex. Second, I think that comparing the complexity of God to the complexity of the universe is like comparing apples and oranges. It's an invalid comparison. And third, I don't think there's any good reason to reject the notion that the cause can be more complex than the effect. I just don't think that's a valid line of thinking, and I'll explain why. The third reason, I think, is the linchpin. It is the most important argument in the case I'm going to present. Let's start from the top. Is God complex? Now, some people might say, well, if your God is all-powerful, if he's so all-knowing, if he's this perfection, then he must be very, very complicated, more complicated than the mightiest computer on earth, and so forth and so on. I disagree with that notion. God's power stems from his perfection, the fact that he is the epitome of power, of knowledge, and so forth and so on. And perfection does not necessarily imply complexity. Take a sphere, for example. A perfect sphere is quite simple. It's mathematically simple, can be described by a single equation. But a rough sphere, well, something that's not a perfect sphere, is a lot more complex. It takes a lot more mathematical complexity to describe its surface, for example. So perfection does not necessarily imply complexity. By the same token, God's perfection does not necessarily make him complex. Now, Dawkins says, well, if your God is capable of answering the prayers or listening to the prayers of millions or billions of people all at once, then he must surely be quite complicated. I don't think that logically follows. See, if you were to develop a machine that could respond to millions or billions of prayers all at once, or even just listen to millions and billions of prayers all at once, certainly that would be a complicated machine. But there we're talking about a system, or something like, we're talking about a constructed system where you have parts interacting with each other. In contrast, God is a unity, where there is no interaction between components of God. You know, it's not a valid comparison. We might choose to think that way because we're used to thinking in terms of machines and communication systems and computers and so forth and so on. But I don't think logically it follows that God is complex. Which leads to the second way in which I think this claim fails. To say that God is more complex than the universe itself is drawing an invalid comparison. The universe is complicated because it is basically an incredibly elaborate mechanism with components interacting with each other gravitationally through electromagnetic interactions. At the atomic level, you have the strong and weak nuclear forces interacting in very complicated ways. It is like the most complex mechanism that anybody could imagine. God's complexity, on the other hand, is of an entirely different matter, precisely because he's not a mechanism. His complexity, such as it is, would be in terms of his character, his personality, his motivations, and so forth and so on. You just can't make a valid comparison between the two. The third and most important reason, though, and even if you reject the first two reasons, I think the third reason is the most important flaw in his thinking. Why should we say that the source of something, that the cause of something has to be a less complicated explanation than the effect? Consider Mount Rushmore. I like to mention Mount Rushmore because Mount Rushmore is a perfect example of something that could have in principle been constructed through natural means by wind and erosion, for example, but no sane person would look at that and say, ah, maybe that happened by random chance. Even if you have no idea who those four gentlemen on the mountain are, you would be able to recognize this as the work of a human being, or human beings, precisely because it exhibits some of the characteristics I talked about in one of my videos. It exhibits a high degree of order, it's incredibly improbable, and there's an apparent purpose behind the structure. Now, who built Mount Rushmore? It was the work of human designers and human workers. Now, any given human being is going to be vastly more complex than Mount Rushmore itself. But that doesn't stop us from postulating that human beings constructed it. Again, even if you had no idea of its history, if you had no idea who those four people were, you would recognize this as the work of human beings, of human agents. The question isn't what is the simplest explanation we can come up with, or what is an explanation that's simpler than the effect. The real question is, what is the best explanation? And if that explanation, that cause, happens to be more complex than the thing you're trying to explain, so be it. By the way, I'd like to use this as a springboard to talk about another topic. A lot of people choose to reject God's existence, and they try to find reasons for doing so. I believe that's what's happening with Dawkins' reasoning here. He's trying to find a reason to reject the notion of design, instead of going where the evidence points. You see that time and again. For example, you have people concocting these elaborate theories about how to explain away the historical evidence for the resurrection. They'll acknowledge the evidence, such as Paul's conversion and you know, the willingness of the apostles to die for the cause and so forth and so on. But they'll concoct explanations like saying, oh, maybe the apostles all hallucinated it, or maybe they contracted some rare disease that made them, you know, irrational, or maybe Jesus had an identical twin, and so forth and so on. Even the response to my videos, you see that a lot. When I talk about cosmic design, for example, you get people saying, well, maybe the physicists are all wrong and some other form of life would have existed anyway. We have no idea what that life would be, but you got to believe it would happen. One person even says, well, to explain away the appearance of design, all you have to do is, you know, acknowledge that some other form of life would have existed. I say, well, what type of life would exist if, say, the universe had consisted entirely of hydrogen, or contained no hydrogen whatsoever, which would result from tiny variations in the strong nuclear force? And he says, well, here's how we can explain that away. Let's say that the universe consists of nothing but hydrogen. We can define life to be any self-replicating system. And if so that would cover things like computer viruses. We can consider computer viruses to be alive. And okay, yes, no biology textbook accepts that definition, but let's believe that 50, 100 years from now, everyone will come around and we'll accept that definition. Oh, and let's suppose that maybe there's some proton-sized matter out there that will duplicate itself, replicate itself, like, you know, and so we can call that alive. See how that's presumption upon presumption after presumption. In other words, rejecting what science currently teaches, postulating things that are not evidence, and trusting that the scientific community will come around to this bizarre definition of life. That's not proceeding from the evidence, folks. That's finding a conclusion and figuring out a way to arrive at that conclusion, regardless of what the actual evidence may say. Now, hardened skeptics will take that route. Hardened skeptics will just decide, hey, I'm going to reject God no matter what. But I'm hoping that there are people out there who are listening and who are indeed searching, and they're trying to flesh out these issues themselves and trying to ask themselves the hard questions. Is there a God? Was Jesus whom people say he is? And so forth and so on. And I say, you know, start from the evidence and go where it points. There's plenty of evidence to believe that God exists. It takes tremendous mental gyrations to try to explain that away, such as the gyrations I talked about a moment ago with this elaborate scenario considering proton-sized matter in a universe that consists entirely of hydrogen and the like. You know, please don't do that. Please don't try to find a way to explain the evidence away at all costs. Go where the evidence points. And the evidence points towards a creator. And I believe there's also plenty of evidence to point toward Jesus Christ being who he said he was. We'll talk about that in additional videos. I've talked about some of it in some of the videos I've published already. I'm hoping and praying that people's eyes will be opened.